starting? Cool. Well, abrupt. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming to this talk slash discussion slash conversation slash. We are here to talk about publishing and media and experiences and things like that through printed matter and also some digital matter. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. I just want to quickly start with an acknowledgement, just acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we are on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Wurrung language group, and just pay my respects to elders past, present, and just giving thanks to the contribution of culture of over 60,000 years to what makes Australia great. Yeah, really stoked to be here and chat with everyone and kind of have these guys here chatting about things as well. We want to keep this pretty open, so I'm going to, if there's any questions that anyone has, you can kind of maybe just make a mental note of that and we'll allow some time at the end. And please, by all means, like any question is exciting, so don't hold back on that. To start, we'll just do a bit of an intro. My name is Ben. I'm from Good Sport magazine, and we've just released issue 5, which you can see over there. And the theme for this issue was all around communication, and we explored basically from an A to Z of types of communication, in a way kind of through sports, but how people communicate with others, or through how people communicate to sport and how sport communicates back. And we're just kind of really interested in different mediums of communication, and I guess one of the reasons we're here today is to kind of talk about the printed matter as a form of communication and as a tool for that, and from different experiences and different practices. So just to give everyone an intro, we've got Christina, Matt and Sarah, and I'll just get them to kind of give a quick intro to who they are and what their practice and what their background is, and then we'll kind of kick off with some themes.
Right, over to me. So I'd also like to pay my respect to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, to which are the lands that I live, work and play, and to their elders past, present, emerging. This land teaches me so much and has taught me so much, and it's where a lot of my work emerges from, in that space. So my name's Christina, as Ben said, and thank you for having me here today. And I run a project, an initiative called Terrain. So Terrain is an initiative that is centred around reminding us that we live in a more than human world and that we are embedded within this world. So there's several kind of projects under Terrain and what I do. And under it, which is kind of a connection through publishing, in addition to Ben asking me to publish an article and do some photography for Good Sport issue 5, is that I launched the Terrain Bookshelf, which is an initiative that is centred around a curated collection of publications around ecology, culture, technology and technology. And it's a collection of publications that shows us the blueprints we need to move forward in this future world, where we can centre ecology and understand our relationship to this world that we've so much severed our connection from. So it's a ecological bookshop, and I'd like to say, and I'm still fact checking the term, but Melbourne's first more than human and ecological bookstore. So a bookstore around ecology that isn't necessarily, agriculture and permaculture, or biology, and kind of looking at nature as a something to be used as in like kind of a one-way kind of relationship, but looking at nature as a way to remind ourselves what it means to be human and the severed connection we have to our essential our soul and our earth. And in many ways, this is where the root cause of this ecological crisis that we're facing tends to come from. And so unless we can reconcile this relationship, that is where we can start to move forward as one kind of living planet. So that's kind of the grounding in my practice. But the bookshelf is an initiative through that, and it's kind of been an opportunity to share resources and publishing, and also I think some of the ideas we'll be exploring today very much around what I'd like to, my vision for the bookshelf and how I see it functioning in Melbourne too. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Christina. My name is Matt Ward. I'm a publisher and a bookseller. I own and run a publisher called Uro Publications and a bookshop called Bookshop by Uro, which is just over in the corner here in Collingwood Yards. As a publisher, we've been in business now for about nearly a decade and a half, publishing mostly design in the built environment, so architecture, a little bit of interior design, landscape architecture, urbanism and planning. And that's very much the focus of our bookstore as well, which we opened in a sort of perfectly timed way, more or less right at the start of the pandemic. Our interests broadly, I suppose, are kind of focused around place in a way, so probably not radically dissimilar to what you talk about a little bit with your practice, Christina. We're very much interested in what it means to shape our world and in this part of the world ultimately as built environment design practitioners. So that could be landscape architects, that could be placemakers, that could be architects, or any number of other people that are taking active interest, I guess, in shaping the way we live here. So yeah, that's about me. Sarah.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lay. I'm a producer in advertising and a multidisciplined artist. I'm really interested in building the bridges between the commercial world and the art world. Really interested in creating relationships and community within our spaces.
Awesome, so good. So yeah, as you can see, we've got a few kind of entry points and perspectives that we can kind of touch on to talk about. And so I guess our theme that we wanted to run through today was looking at the now, then and later, specifically looking at print publications and media and our kind of relationships to those. And obviously now being like the present, then being like our previous knowledge and experience and perspectives, and later kind of thinking about like the future of these types of things. So to kind of kick off, I have a couple of questions that all run through broadly, and then I might pass on some specific questions to everyone. The first question in a broad sense, and we'll kind of just go through it, just like a quick kind of off the top of your head. We don't need to go super deep dive, we can just kind of roll into it. But I guess after the last 18 months of being predominantly online, what is your current relationships to print, and how are you all using print at the moment based on the last 18 months? You can start, Christina.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is something I feel like I've had a bit of space to sit through, even sitting through the massive amount of gridlock traffic in Melbourne at the moment. And I know it's a bit of a common theme, but I'm kind of thinking like this post-lockdown energy, it's this total rush. It's like a rat race, and it's that lead up to Christmas. And I find myself turning to these, very calming artifacts that is like a printed publication, a book, a magazine, and finding that space to sit with that thing, and whether or not I actually find the time to read it cover to cover or get through a chapter or finish an article, it's a reminder of the pace that I think is the most sentient one within ourselves that actually makes sense, and it's kind of the pace that the world actually moves and functions at. And so much of what we've layered on now, and I think we're all feeling it in our own way, this rush is just, it's an opportunity to be reminded of stillness and quiet and the rituals that surround a book, and having a cup of tea, or looking out the window and looking at a tree, or listening to some calming music while you read, or you just sit in total stillness. And so that's been my kind of experience with shifting to publications now. And I would always have turned to them as a reminder, but I mean, we could even do a show of hands here, like how often do you sit down with a book and then you kind of get distracted by a notification and you don't actually read the book? So is there any guilty in here? Yeah.
Do not disturb.
Do not disturb mode. Yeah, but it's still the reminder, and you're sitting and you have a drink and be calm.
That's the quintessential problem with any kind of device-based kind of reading, I think, is they're just set up to constantly distract you, which is why books are so great in some ways, and that ritual associated with reading.
No notifications built in.
Yeah, that's right. But also, like, they come with their own operating system, really, which is kind of you. And you don't need to have proprietary software to run it, and it doesn't sit in Silicon Valley's world or its walled garden or anything like that.
In a data center somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't need an update.
Exactly. I mean, I think for us, we were in quite a unique position because we'd made a big investment. We've always been both digital and physical print publishers, but and I love both of those mediums for different reasons. But we made a decision with perfect timing to invest very heavily in the physical, in the shape of a physical bookshop that was quite expensive to fit out. And, you know, it was a kind of flag in the sand saying we believe in the physical, and then bang, the pandemic hits, and I thought we were cooked. It was just like we're about to go bankrupt because we'd kind of overextended ourselves a little bit. You know, luckily we had a bit of government support, and we were lucky to be here in Collingwood Yards, and a lot of support from this organisation as well. But I think what was really telling for me over the course of the pandemic is we'd always had a kind of digital bookshop, and at one point a very small little kind of hobby style little garage that we were running a bookshop out of in Fitzroy. But we saw some of our biggest days over the course of the pandemic in terms of book sales. And I know, you know, for the bigger suppliers like the Readings and so forth, that was a big part of their experience in some ways. But what's distinct about what we do as publishers is we're really particular. We're not really selling books for the purposes of entertainment. We're not really selling books for the purposes of escapism. We're selling books that are about bringing communities of practice together and sharing knowledge in some ways. And it seemed to me there was a real hunger out there for that kind of particular practice, that particular publishing practice. And it was brought together in a way. People had an opportunity to reach out to other people through the medium of the book in a really important way, I think. And we saw a really distinctive shift actually in the kinds of books that were being bought and consumed by our customer base towards more of an interest in the more than human, more of an interest in urban ecology, more of an interest in the way our environments are shaped, as well as, of course, like those sort of more domestic concerns, like how do I create a space that can be like a home office and a kitchen, you know, and a creche and all the rest of that stuff. That was definitely part of it, but perhaps the more interesting trend for me was to see how people were beginning to get much more interested in these bigger questions of how we shape our cities in a way that they can be good places to live, not just for us, but for, you know, the flora and fauna that ultimately are also part and parcel of a kind of urban life.
I think during pandemic time, the last 18 months, I'm really like an in real life kind of human being, and it was really, really difficult for me to kind of like nurture these relationships that we have online and also the relationships that we have in real life. It created an amazing tool for us all to kind of engage, network, and see what each other was up to. And being able to nurture those relationships that you wouldn't normally have in real life kind of opened up a lot of doors and a lot of pathways in worlds that, you know, I had no idea about or I had no reason being in. And being able to finally, now that we're out of lockdown and we're in real life, and being able to engage in these kind of conversations or, you know, experience things together in real life, I think that just like, it just gave us room to really be ourselves during lockdown and channel in that real life kind of moments. So I really love what you were saying about kind of the stillness that we kind of earn and yearn for. And I think that, you know, when we're looking at print, it's always these like, it's the most kind of like, it's like the primary form of where we access information and where we learn. So I always turn to reading and books in you know, endeavours to learning.
Also just want to jump in there too, and like further to what you're both saying, in the sense that they provide a space, like physical bookstores, and even the then of publishing. Like I so much associate books and my childhood experiences around like libraries and like school library, and then the high school library, then the university libraries, and then going to a public library, and like seeing these as spaces where you're in a collective stillness, like you're in a space that everyone is respecting a sense of silence, and you're all there consuming information in some sense in the same pace. And the role of bookstores today as being a way to nurture community, to connect with others interested in the same disciplines or ideas or practitioners in different fields that may need to connect with, you know, an ecologist connecting with a landscape designer, an architect, or you know, urban planner seeking ways to embed more than human ideas within their practice. And it's a deep form of collaboration and how we're to collaborate with each other moving forward, and also recognise that no one person can do it all themselves, and that's the magic and beauty of collaboration, because it can be this way to connect. And I think we do need more spaces that connect people and personalities and differences in these kind of spaces.
Yeah, totally. After you say that, actually, I'm reminded of a scenario or an experience, and this kind of leads to a question for Matt, and then a second part for Sarah. I lived in Amsterdam for a couple of years, and I was kind of frustrated with, and I was having a chat with another friend who's an artist, and we were frustrated with the idea of like algorithms kind of showing you this. If you search for something online, you basically get the top results that everyone ends up seeing. And I was like, where's my influence coming from if I'm looking for things to research or get inspiration from or whatever it may be? So I started returning to the library, where you have to kind of pick something out and think, okay, well, I'm choosing to look at this. It's not dictating it for me. So for Matt, I'm kind of thinking about like the role of a physical space for books and magazines. What would be the most kind of exciting prospect for you for like a physical space when we head further into things like words like the metaverse and so on and so forth? Like, what still excites you about the physical space for books in that kind of frame of mind?
I mean, I guess like we're already and have been deeply immersed in the metaverse since the 80s, since, you know, was it Gibson or Sterling? One or the other coined the term. I think it was Gibson. You know, that's part and parcel of our headspace and has been for a long time. And I don't think we're going to go deeper into it. You know, there's already gaming communities that have been engaged in metaverses for decades. I think what we are going to see is more and more people coming back to bookshops, which is why we've kind of invested in it to begin with. And I think what's getting back to that idea of the kind of algorithmic curation, you know, the idea that you've got some Silicon Valley string of code that's deciding what you're interested in and then feeding it to you relentlessly. You know, the promise of the, like, we're really getting back into like 90s postmodernist digital kind of theory here, but like the promise of the information superhighway was like having everything accessible at all times, right? And that is kind of what we have, but also what we have increasingly is like more and more siloization. People aren't talking to one another. And the beautiful thing about a book is once it's out in the world, it goes all kinds of places. You don't know where it ends up. And it often ends up in places where it's going to have a much longer lifespan than something that's digital, because of the nature of the way Silicon Valley changes so quickly and the tools that are required to make use of that codex, you know, in a very digital sense rather than a book sense. The beauty of a bookstore, of course, is like it's intrinsically non-algorithmic. Like people come there and conversations happen. They happen organically with people who may not necessarily have expected to encounter other practitioners in their space, in that space, and they also happen in a very kind of calculated way, which is, you know, we as booksellers have our own taste preferences and our own interests and our own specializations that we can bring to that kind of conversation. And there's human cues and all the rest of it that ultimately at the end of the day, I don't think an algorithm is anywhere close to being able to replicate in that context.
Yeah, so true, so true. And then I guess to almost follow up on what you're saying, Matt, in terms of like those two differences of like digital versus space, physical space being like the bookstore in this instance. For Sarah, we were just kind of chatting a little bit before about the missing kind of piece or the middle between, say, commerce or commercial kind of advertising, for lack of a better word, and like art, and kind of what we're looking at, like, I guess the right word, what is missing between there, and trying to like frame the question right, like yeah, is there something missing, and kind of how do you see that? What do you kind of see for that?
I think like the two worlds of conversation in art, and there's two worlds of conversation, one in art and one in commerce, and working in advertising for the last 2.5, nearly 3 years, I've had to learn their language and had to kind of figure out as an artist, like, how do I want to be communicated to? And in that business world, sometimes they're not so sensitive to artists, and you kind of get told all the time that you have to kill your babies, or you have to learn how to kill your babies and just become really ruthless in your creativity. This notion of being intentional about the work that you create as an artist is really important in kind of combating this like commercial world, especially when the commercial world is kind of demanding a lot from you, or maybe asking you things that you might not feel comfortable with. It's like finding the language to communicate why that doesn't work for you in a way that's like not going to offend anyone, or in a way that's like, you know, not going to stir up too much drama or too much, you know, because we're all just trying to like, you know, run the same direction and head the same way. So it's important that, you know, both business and art are both intentional about what they're creating and what they bring to the table.
Yeah, so interesting. There was something, I think you were saying something as well about, I guess, finding the right medium for things as well. And obviously we, maybe as a photographer as well who works commercially, you kind of, everything kind of ends up having this pretty linear output of a digital space. Maybe the format slightly changes. And I'm kind of interested, and this is probably open to anyone here, about making decisions around the right output, and maybe thinking more specifically as books or magazines, and even just maybe from my own experience, like maybe there's like a switch in thinking when you're putting something into a physical, tangible object of something. There's more consideration and time and effort because you kind of see it. And maybe just, yeah, like expanding on thoughts of that, of choosing the right medium that is separate to a digital kind of thing, and maybe how they work together as well.
I think just from like this like digital space, you kind of have no boundaries, and it's your like digital playground, and you get to decide the vibe, you get to say what you want to say, and you get to curate what you want people to see from you. And I think that can easily be lost with all the clutter and the noise of the internet. And oftentimes the most valuable experiences we have are in real life, in person, and engaging in experiences that we can feel something that can become memories for us. And that's why I think I really loved Tree's exhibit that you did, Christina.
Thank you.
Because it really it reminded us all that we are more than human, and that we're engaged in this world, and this is the world that we can breathe in, smell, see, learn from. And I think those kind of really rich experiences that we get to experience together as a community kind of offer us another like perspective in like how the world is, you know, coming to place.
And also like this, it's kind of funny how there's just this huge binary and like antagonism between the digital and physical. And it's quite funny because I decided to use that as Terrain's, you know, elevator pitch line. Like Terrain is an initiative that creates playful physical and digital spaces to remind us that we're embedded in a more than human world. And I kind of even came up with this word like phygital, like they're phygital spaces, because everything has this like counterpart to it as well. And the internet today, it's subject to so much algorithmic violence. It kind of tells us what we didn't think we wanted to hear, but it, you know, it pushes that towards us. And so, but where did the intuition go between you walk into a shop and something's just shining at you, or, you know, you see a relic somewhere and that becomes something that is actually quite a meaningful breadcrumb in your own path and journey and what you're doing in life. And that's often like how I've then followed through like the track to decide, you know, what Terrain does now. And I think the whole kind of question around medium as well was something I've always been like sitting with, because my background and part of the development of Terrain was through an academic background in geography. And so it was asking these questions around, you know, if we have all the technology and all the answers we need to this crisis we're facing, then why aren't we mobilizing? Why aren't we doing what needs to be done? So asking those questions, and came through a lot of great answers, but so much of it written through like a very dense language in academia, and the big words, very big words, which, you know, I love these words, and I still like very much connect with my academic community, and I still have my feet, you know, grounded in that space. But I also find that there is another language that can come through, and that is the language of story. And that's how we've, you know, almost programmed ourselves from the get-go, and many cultures around the world connect and share what it, you know, means to live and create the world and be with the world through stories. And it's kind of a radical act through dark times these days to be finding and becoming with through story, and sharing stories of how to live, and and kind of like not complicating them a little too much, and like getting to the root of the language that connects us all and is accessible by all. And so kind of de-academicizing is like a bit of like a constant journey I have with like finding the language to connect with all of us that unifies us, and the slowness around those words too.
I guess one thing that I've sort of wrestled with regularly as somebody that works in both digital and print publishing is like the question of scale and ultimately kind of control. Like when you, I mean, for you guys as artists and photographers working visually, this would be something that would come up a lot, I'd imagine, because on the one hand you've got an image that can be of any scale, but on the other hand you've also got to work with like these intense constraints. Like most people are going to see it on a phone that's like, 3-4 inches wide or something. So it's very difficult to kind of, it's become a bit of a cliche, this word, but kind of curate an experience, I feel, in that context, particularly with the in publishing with books. There's a whole series of adjacencies that take place on a page. There's a very linear way of kind of telling a story. Everything about the creation of the book is about creating a kind of singular artifact in a way. Whereas in the digital space, everything kind of militates against that. They basically want you to kind of atomize stuff into constituent parts.
It's chaotic.
Yeah. And then one thing ends
so
up on
overwhelming when it all pops up, and then you're on a computer screen, and then like suddenly there's a word there and you don't know what it is, and you Google it, and then you've ended up through another
you go through your loophole.
Yeah.
It's really hard to apply that the craft of bookmaking and book design and storytelling through books to a digital context, I think, in a way that captures some of that sense of the artifact, is my experience with it. Like the whole e-publication process for me early on was really exciting because I thought we'd be able to bring all this richness in terms of audio and video and all the rest of it to the storytelling experience. But that's not the way things have gone, really. Like things have kind of headed in a direction wherein the kind of content can be recombined in lots of different ways that aren't necessarily the ways you intend them to be redesigned, and that brings with it its own kinds of strengths. But I think for that reason, like the book has a lot more importance now than perhaps it did seemingly like 10-15 years ago in the face of EPUB and digital media generally.
And also just on the EPUB too, and like the emergence of saying, it's greener to look at everything online. It's greener not to print it. It's greener not to use paper. But we're kind of seeing and unraveling the lie of that at the moment with the fact that everything that exists online takes energy, because it's not just sitting in this, speculative cloud. It's real stuff that takes real energy in data centers, in places all over the world. And the thing with the publication is, if you're actually going to be, say, visiting this one article or piece of writing several times, the embodied emissions associated with printing it is actually far less than reloading that web page or very dense web page that has a lot of stuff on it, like video files, audio files, JavaScript animations, all this stuff that runs in the background. And if you're going to be reloading that site many times, like there's energy involved in that reload button. So this is kind of where a space that I'm shifting through into like regenerative internet infrastructure, static servers, and like how can we actually have the internet function a little bit more eco-friendly? What if these data centers and servers were more isolated? What if they were solar powered? How can we have green internet for the things that we do still rely on to load? And like what would it take to get, using a machine to feel as refreshing as taking a walk in the woods? Like, can we get there with our internet? Can it feel like that? Can we not be subject to algorithmic violence and actually have more like decentralized and distributed networks that keep the whole thing going, where we all have our own data and, you can kind of own the book in your own way, and then it can connect with others and you can share it, but it's not really sitting in an algorithm somewhere. It's just a bit more offline.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting you say that, because a couple of things come to mind, and you think of like your MacBook is designed to look like a beautiful book. Like it almost has the same design elements as like a nice, clean book that you can open up and spend some nice time with. But what's in it is probably not so much that. And I read somewhere on that same sentiment as like being online, that even your email has a carbon footprint, because there's just spam and there's so much data in it, and you can actually kind of calculate it, which is kind of freaky. And then I'm kind of going back to the printed book, and we've always kind of been in a little bit conflict with printing a magazine, because we're like, okay, this is definitely taking up resources, we're shipping it around the world, but then my kind of optimism is that it will last, like you were saying before, Matt, like it will last a long time. Maybe it turns up in different places. The information is hopefully something that can live on and is classic enough that whether you wrote a story 5 years ago, it might still be relevant to someone in 10 years from now. Whereas online, you know, maybe it gets lost in your bookmarks or so on and so forth, and the cycle is a lot faster. I'm kind of interested, even maybe for you, Christina, to expand on that idea of like longevity of information and overloading of information, and maybe more from like that ecological or environmental kind of point of view, like considered information in a magazine, for example, would you hope that it would last longer and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of, like I was saying just a few moments earlier, the idea around like printing things out can be like, so they can last a long time, but it's just this matter of like why do we constantly decide that like the digital stuff is like more sustainable? Because it kind of just became a very, very sophisticated marketing like kind of, and I feel like you'd have some thoughts around this, Sarah.
Definitely.
A big like marketing initiative around like making everything digital, but really like there wasn't such a need to do that, and it's just like a constant need to stay connected, to even be connected to that information, and then you're connected to that information and you don't realize actually how big that web is of information that you're part of. And like we have 2 eyes and 2 hands, and like we're kind of just these little physical beings sitting on a rock floating through space, and there's only so much that our bodies can process at one time, and so that we get a lot of information and analysis paralysis that can happen, and this can actually get in the way of say connecting with matters that are important, or say mobilizing. So this was kind of where my background in like environmental psychology and like understanding these mechanisms that stop us from mobilizing, and it is this information overload that can make us feel like we can't do anything, or we can't move, or we feel stuck or frozen. So any way to contribute to kind of slowing that pace down and sieving through so much of that noise, I think is work that's so much needed during this time, and almost invaluable in its format. I mean, like, the marketing of the internet and the speed of it, and
for sure. I think like growing up on the internet, I had Tumblr growing up, and that was kind of my little community of interesting tastemakers that kind of like was in completely different worlds that I was in front of, and it helped me engage with people like-minded, and it helped me find people like-minded. And then growing up and getting into advertising world, I started using the internet like with more of a childlike perspective. And it wasn't something that I was engaging in actively. It was something that I was intentionally engaging in to kind of connect with my friendships, to connect with people that, you know, inspired me and could teach me. And it offered me resources to dive into books, to dive into print magazines, to dive into music, to dive into art and film, and just all these different kind of worlds that I was not accessible to me at that time, being a little baby in the flats. Like we didn't have much, and so kind of being able to engage in these experiences and bring them out of the internet, and just like be really intentional with the way that we use the internet to kind of be in favor of what we want to see in the world, I think is a really important perspective. And there is so much like algorithmic abuse, like it is chaos and it is nuts. And I think that's why when we focus on artists' voices and perspectives, we can start to kind of break through those like algorithmic barriers of discovery.
Yeah, that's so true. That makes me think of something then in terms of like influence of information, and when we are putting it into something like a printed object, or a tangible object, in this case like a magazine, kind of understanding where that influence comes from if we're spending a lot of time online, and then when we're making decisions, and maybe this could be for you, Matt, in terms of like publishing and those decisions you make when you're kind of working with an artist or someone who's about to put a book together, how has your kind of decision making about what goes in a book changed, say, in the last 10 years because of how people are reading and using books and magazines? Like, I know for sure it definitely has for us as a magazine.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I think is really important about the print process as opposed to the digital process is it imposes a whole series of rigours and processes on you that are much easier to circumvent when you're in the digital space, for better or worse. Like, digital kind of lends itself to quick and dirty in some ways, and not always in the best of ways, because you can always fix it later, whereas print is not that. Once it's out there, it's done. And your mistakes are there for everybody to pick apart, and your arguments are out there for everybody to pick apart. Your values propositions are out there for everyone to pick apart, which I think is a really important constraint, because it does mean you're so much more disciplined in the print production stage. And I think the other thing that comes along with that is that whole series of rituals, not so much necessarily, although this is a big part of it, the personal rituals of reading, but also the rituals of the book publishing process around book launches, book selling. All of that stuff is about bringing communities of practice together. And importantly, I think very early on, and this is very true of magazines, I'm sure this is what you guys have experienced as well, it's you're creating a community in the process of actually putting the print publication together. Like, it's very, very rare, if not, I literally cannot think of a single time where I have worked with, because of the nature of what we publish, with a single author in a process that just involves we as publisher, them as author. Like, there's always a huge team of people involved, and there's a whole process of implicit and explicit kind of critical decisions that are made over that process that influence the final outcome. Whether or not we've changed the way that or the kinds of things that we publish in a kind of print context, I'm not so sure in relation to the digital. We have thought, and some of our books do actively kind of court that digital space. They have QR codes in them that point out to digital media. But to this day, I'm not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, because it sort of broke down the singularity of that artifact in a way that, in a really literal way, it means that you've got to make sure that the QR code still works 20 years later, 100 years later, 150 years later.
Mine always break.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's like, oh God, it's self-redundant, But in a sort of slightly more abstract way, it means that idea of the book being all it needs to be as a sort of singular moment in time, a kind of waypoint, and also self-contained in a way that anyone can pick it up and pretty much understand it, cultural differences and book production notwithstanding, and language and all the rest of it. It's got a tradition of 2 millennia basically behind it. People just intuitively kind of get it, and as soon as you break down that wall, I tend to think something is lost in a way. Sorry, that doesn't really answer the question.
I think it's interesting for sure. Maybe in terms of the magazine through Good Spot, we've definitely maybe not super considered and gone oh, this needs to be closer to an online thing. I mean, maybe from the beginning we had a website, but we kind of actively were didn't put printed stories online. And I think we were chatting about this last night even, and saying there's kind of a reason to have something in print, and there's almost a defining thing to go online, and maybe making something for print didn't really work for online, but we're trying to find that gap, and that's kind of what we're talking about, Sarah, is what's in the middle. I think we're trying to close a gap somewhere.
It kind of goes into your theme around the present, what is the present of publishing, and it's kind of looking at, say, a book, a printed artifact, and going, well, this is a product of relationships, and it took a lot of relationships to put together that thing and make it happen. The graphic designers, the printers, anyone involved in the PR of the publication, and the contributors, and it's this whole web that forms around the thing. And when you look at online publishing, depending on the outlet, of course, but it's a much more kind of linear and very short process involved, where you can kind of essentially, I could write something right now and click publish, and there it goes. But there wasn't really many people connected into that process. That kind of took a bit of time to form, and it can just kind of go out there. So it changes like the way that, you know, what's out there and like how it's created.
I think the internet really broke down a lot of barriers to access and to be able to publish and to be able to put out, you know, your perspective on the world and your voice. And we see that a lot with like underground artists and, you know, them paving their own ways into these rooms that and demanding what they, you know, they're worth, and demanding that their visions get seen and heard and their voices get heard. These just like climbing those pillars in order to get to those rooms is a lot of work sometimes. And, you know, a lot of artists and a lot of creatives just like, it's a struggle to even be in those rooms and to even find doors open to get into those rooms. So shout out
big
the internet.
snaps on that one. It's like, that's true, because like getting to even being part of that process of the publication can be not necessarily gatekept, but like subject to maybe
it can just be a scary conversation too.
Yeah,
sure.
to like take your work into that space, or like be respected by your peers to go into publish or in some kind of space. But you know, breaking in initially is very difficult for so many voices that do need to be heard and have that space. So maybe there could be some hybrid there in like the future of publishing as well. I mean, like I know like so many artists and voices are found now through the internet because it's a way to find an encounter idea or an image, and then to pursue where that voice came from, and then maybe explore that further in like the development of print.
Yeah, interesting, there's a few things just there like that we were talking about, and I guess it talks back to our original theme of communication, or publishing as a tool for communication. So I'm kind of interested on everyone's perspective on just, what your perspective and experience of communication through a medium of, say, for example, magazines, whether you're making something or you're digesting it, like so you pick up a magazine, and how you may learn through that, and just your kind of experiences with like what being with like a magazine is for you guys, and then how you communicate. I guess there's two forms of communication, like how you communicate with something, and then how you go out into the world and maybe share that and take influence and learning from that and add it to, say, your creative practice.
I mean, I feel like I may have like elaborated on some of like the stillness and those ideas earlier, but aside from that as well, it's like I read and receive most of my news through like the printed Guardian Weekly, because I prefer to read news that can be so overwhelming in a printed form, so that my mind doesn't go into like exploring something that's really triggering and then taking into other tabs and kind of just having it in front. So it goes back to like the broadsheet and like the printed printing press and what it's done for like news and circulation, but having a way to just not tail off into other directions and just give some focus, and how it leans into other work is always, I feel like, some of the ideas and maybe contributions to conversations I've actually always emerged through something I've read on printed material rather than the screen. I find it a lot harder for my mind to sometimes maybe retain information that comes from a screen, and so if it's written down, I find that is something that sticks in my memory. Maybe it's the place-based association of how our brain works and how we create memories, and we need places to create memories. And so sometimes being in front of the screen, and I feel like this is an experience of a lot of people through lockdowns and COVID and being online for everything, and classrooms online and online classes and that whole siesta, and how hard it was for students to like retain the coursework and the material and the ideas, because there wasn't that tutorial environment or classroom environment surrounding the learning process. So it deeply affects my ability to learn and grow as well by having these materials. So that's probably one of the big things for me.
Kind of inherent in that, as this is sort of publishing 101 really, is the idea of like, who are you talking for and who are you talking to ultimately? Like, who's the audience, and who are you communicating on behalf of, or what have you? And I guess this is probably a question for you actually, Ben, because I'm super fascinated by good sport, because you guys kind of went out there, and it feels to me like you've kind of created your own audience in a way. Like the typical sports publications, very much grounded in that sort of fandom world, which is about, you've got your pre-made audience ultimately, like the Manchester United fans or the soccer fans or the basketball fans or whatever. But you guys are much more interested in kind of periphery of all of that, the cultural periphery, which I think is really telling about not just the codes that you're talking about, but also about the communities and the cultures those codes sit within. Did you guys think you had an audience in mind? Who was your reader when you were creating Good Sport?
I think the reader was basically almost like myself and a few peers. And it was, I guess, based on, like you mentioned, like maybe the nuances and some experience, because I think when the idea was formed, a few, like myself and some peers, were like regaining or finding what sport meant to us again, and probably had left it alone for long because it felt really toxic, and there's a lot of kind of issues with sport, and you know, you could kind of list many kind of problems with it. So I think a lot of us felt alienated from it. We're like, we don't associate with sport, but we want to do something. We want to be active. We want to enjoy it, and so on and so forth. And there is some incredible storytelling, and you know, it kind of covers everything from the performance right down to, you know, art and psychology and politics and all the rest of it, and food.
And halftime oranges.
Yeah, also. So it kind of, as soon as the thread was pulled, we were like, whoa, okay, there is something interesting here, and it does talk directly to our friend group, essentially. And we're like, okay, if our friend group is kind of interested in this, maybe there's a shared experience globally. And I had noticed a slight shift in these kind of more grassroots, you could say, like sporting initiatives, people just kind of getting together and doing it more through like maybe an artistic lens, without using that term art. I guess it just was groups of people from different backgrounds going, hey, you know what, we can actually enjoy the sport without associating with it in the way that it traditionally has been. Yeah, and I guess that thread has just been pulled on over the years, and I feel like now the audience is a lot more solidified and less about our peer group and more about like this kind of global shift of what sport kind of looks and feels like. But it's tricky in a printed magazine because, like we've been talking about, a lot of this kind of quote unquote like content really works online. Like it can be really digestible and really fast. So, and I'm definitely a big believer in like the slow journalism kind of movement of taking our time. We've never done like hardcore deadlines where like once the idea is been in the oven long enough and ready, then I think it's time to come out.
I like that. I think advertising should take a leaf out of your book.
Plus it should be fun. Like I never want it to feel like hard work and stress. Like
it's got to be ready when it's ready.
Yeah, I don't mind the pressure of it. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to put it on, but it's that good pressure. So it's still an interesting thing to navigate because, you know, I don't know, I always said once we got to say 5 issues would have a stronger identity. I kind of knew that. I knew it would take at least 5 to even understand what we were really talking about. Like I do, if I look back on the first issues, they're a lot more, I guess, linear and say it straight, if that makes sense, compared to where we're at now. So, yeah.
I love that it started as something that you created for your peer group. And I think that's super important when you're trying to protect your voice and protect what kind of creativity you're trying to put out in the world and make it as pure as it should be for your voice and maybe your audience. I think that conversation could get lost along the way, especially when we're trying to play in these communities that we live in the business world and in trying to make a name for ourselves. Oftentimes, when it gets lost, you just kind of, you forget why you began creating in the first place. And so, yeah, the madness and the badness.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, maybe the intention was never for like commercial success. I guess it was, I mean, I guess now I would say it's more based on like thought experiment and going, is there an idea that we can explore? And this probably talks to everyone here, like finding the right medium. And if your medium is like a book or a magazine, it's exploring that idea and finding the right kind of way to communicate it, and then using the whole team of people that work on these things to bring it to life. Because I mean, I realized pretty early on, I was like, it can't be solely my voice, because then it's just me talking to me. So it has to include a wide range of perspectives of all different backgrounds and people and experiences. Otherwise, yeah, what's the point, kind of thing?
It's kind of interesting because on the one hand, it feels to me like what you're kind of pushing against is the tribalism of sport. You know, the idea that you have your team and you have your code and you just very rigidly stick to it. But on the same token, in the process of building an audience, oftentimes that's what you will lean on, is that kind of tribalism in order to make a publication successful.
In a healthy way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're kind of creating a tribe, but it's a diffuse tribe in a way.
Yeah. Interesting to kind of think about it that way, for sure. Yeah, I would say we're probably like the least sport fans going, like, and probably more interested in all those other topics, like intersection of whether it's art or food or architecture or so on and so forth, and you can just kind of weave it in through these ideas that somehow relate to sport in some way or another, kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Looking at our time, I might open up to everyone here if there's any questions that have kind of lingered or that you want to like ask individually or collectively. Feel free to raise a hand, and it can be as wide or as specific as you'd like it to be. Otherwise, we can keep chatting. Questions around publishing?
Sarah and Christina briefly touched on the kind of accessibility that traditional media and print media doesn't really provide, which digital media can provide. And you talked briefly about like QR codes. Is it Matt? Is that?
Yeah.
And I think that often in the case of, like, for example, like a book launch or something, the QR code isn't necessarily for the person. You know, it's like an accessibility thing, maybe, and not for the person who like can read and can see and speaks the same language. I just maybe wanted to hear a little bit more about that from you three.
Like kind of maybe a digital language version of something. So for instance, like having, say, an installation or a work or a piece of writing, and then having an accompanying audio narration. So it makes it, in that kind of...
Really breaks out journalism a little bit. But just about, I guess how it can provide...
It's like another form of communication.
To people who can't read, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of where the magic of the digital format comes through, because we can have access to different ways of seeing and sensing information and receiving information and not feeling left out in some way. And I kind of like, this is a little sidetracked, but I think still relevant, and kind of like the idea and the rationale behind having the Terrain bookshelf was, how can I translate like the core idea of Terrain to remind us that we're embedded in a more than human world? How can I translate that across different projects, across different mediums, across different formats? What would that idea look like as a bookshop? What would that idea look like as an art exhibition? What would that idea look like as a table at the Boating and Fishing Expo at the convention centre? And so kind of like I'd like to think I'm practically applying and experimenting with how I can translate one idea into like many different formats and retaining a sense of accessibility, whether, you know, that's through... I'm not too familiar with like every format, but there's a lot, and how we can embed them into every project that can happen. But I'm constantly thinking about that and like wanting to experiment around that and seeing how I can make this idea accessible to not just say academic audiences or environmentalists. And, you know, that would be like, you know, preaching to the choir for me, and I don't think that's where like the energy is needed. So if I can get that idea out to those that I would find as like more of a challenge to reach out to, then that's kind of more the space that I'd be interested in like translating.
I think one of the really fun ways that we kind of merged this like notion of online world and in real life experiences was with the tiramisu event that we did at Good Gnocchi, and that was kind of like brought together by our relationships online. And it was like Cece had made tiramisu, and it was we connected with Good Gnocchi to kind of host their event. And then it was there was a live drag performance by Scotty So, and friendships made with DJs who came and spun the decks for the night. And then LifeX got involved and lit the event, and it was a in real life experience where we got to experience this like notion of like where tiramisu was created. It was created in the 70s in Italy in Italian brothels, and we had it was all red dim, and it was all just like really felt like a big community vibe, and everyone just kind of getting together in that space and finally like together outside of the internet was a really special way for everyone to connect and just eat and be entertained and just enjoy each other's presence.
And like finding all the like peripheral aspects that you could draw into that very niche idea into one thing, and like realize it's not just making and enjoying and consuming tiramisu. It's like, what's the lighting, what's the sound, and it's kind of like plays into multi-sensory spaces. But there's like so many other ways to communicate one thing rather than even just words alone.
And it helps so much to have a team around you, that one team, one dream, and everyone kind of moving the same way, and everyone's on brief, and everyone's like, coming with the same energy that you have. I think that's like super powerful in being able to create spaces for people to just thrive and be creative.
Yeah, interesting. It kind of makes me think of just in terms of the idea of access, or maybe variety of access is kind of interesting. And like you're mentioning, when you add, for example, like a QR code, that gives maybe a wider group of people an option to look at what you've created, whether it means they're on the other side of the world or they have a difficulty of getting to where you are, or whatever it may be. But then also kind of what we mentioned about finding the right medium, and maybe that doesn't mean it's like one version of the idea, just as you're kind of talking about, and kind of partly why we decided to do a week of events, and this being one of them, is like we did basically like an A to Z of stories in this issue, and then we thought, well, a lot of these can be nice, like you can read them and you might get something from them, but what happens if you add another medium to that story? Can you add more context? Can you offer it to different people? Can you have more conversation around that? And I think maybe that's an interesting thing to come out of something like a publication or a magazine or whatever kind of idea you're working on.
And we were talking a bit about this last night too, in kind of going, between publications, do you then publish online and publish the articles online, and then maybe make a collection or like an annual edition of the publications, the stories and articles and media? And then kind of going, well, also after you complete like the process of printing something, it is surrounded by like author talks and book signings or creating conversations around it, or Foursquare events
adding context,
like we had yesterday, around like the stories and like the content within them, and finding that is also a deep connection to the work and a translation of the material and new ways to access that information or encounter it, even if it's an accident. And having those accidental encounters, I think, is actually where so much of the beauty of where that community is built and is formed and comes together. Usually from a friend that comes with someone, or you just have 10 minutes spare.
That's the best stuff. It's the sweet stuff. Yeah. I think, and being able to maintain that childlike perspective on the world and being really curious about things, I think turning to books and turning to print to find just like little fruits of joy and little fruitful moments of like just something that inspires you to just keep on pushing on for something else. It's just being fun, just having fun.
Yeah, agreed. Love it. Any other questions based on that so far?
Or not on that, or just
not. New questions?
What we had for breakfast.
It's all good if you don't have anything.
I had oats.
Cool. Does there any other questions between you three that you'd like to ask kind of anyone here as well, just before we kind of wrap it up, if you wanted to add any specific kind of topics or thoughts around publishing as communication? feel like we've covered a lot.
We've covered a lot of
Yeah,
ground here.
yeah.
Yeah, it's been a really good conversation to have between the three of us and four. Sorry, Ben.
It's all right. Well, in that sense, then I feel like we can kind of wrap it up and continue these conversations at home over coffee and on the internet and by reading books and magazines and kind of finding that happy medium between both worlds. I mean, they are the same world. It's not two. It is one, I guess. But finding the gaps and filling them if they need to be filled. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes things can be separate. And like you're saying, Sarah, like being curious and finding those accidental moments. Because I think that's kind of maybe what keeps me wanting to like continue doing things in print is those happy accidents and the curiosity around it. And I guess longevity of information, I think is, sometimes you kind of wake up and you're like, why do I make a magazine? It's like insane. Like it's never a commercial endeavor. Like unless you're selling.
It's a total passion project. It's an act of passion and love and investment of time and spending late nights kind of reading over and over and over the same line and kind of wondering if you could say it differently or...
Yeah. I mean, part of me thinks I'd like to apply more of that process to a digital process. And what does it look like to, I don't know, whether you're writing something for a website or creating a website or something. And I mean, I know some digital projects take months and months and months as well, but maybe for just a personal output, maybe taking some of that inspiration to slow
taking
things
good
down.
sport into the metaverse.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Digital
virtual
sport.
world,
Spawning
digital
off
sport.
as a NFT.
Issue 6, metaverse.
Digital
Yes.
Foursquare, I can see that.
Foursquare online.
Yeah, all right, we're on to it. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it for your Saturday afternoons. We'll stick around, so if you want to chat with anyone and catch up, we'll be hanging out. We've got issue 5 for sale as well if you did want to pick up a copy here. Otherwise, Uro Books have copies as well, so feel free to head over there and check out any of the other publications. And you can check out Christina's work at
terrain.earth or terrain.earth on Instagram. The .earth is the domain, so it does work. But the full website's coming and there's a bit more kind of in the motions. But I'll put some of my card out as well, so if anyone wants to take one, welcome to.
And you can find Uro Books over the road and at...
Bookshop. Bookshop by Uro.com.
Cool.
Or Uro Publications.
Nice. And Sarah's Instagram is currently down.
It got hacked.
I'm currently disabled for violating advertising terms.
Wow, it's so rich.
We forgot to include the
Also,
conversation
they
of
weren't
censorship.
specific. They weren't specific with me, so I'm currently incognito. Just catch me in real life. Yeah.
So if you make a magazine, you can put anything you want in it.
That's it.
And no one's going to censor
Yeah, I
you.
will. I'll be pitching to you.
Yeah, so there we go. But thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
Thanks.
guys. Thank you.